As a complement to the Cercarbono policy framework, 3 specific tools have been developed, which will be briefly described in this video. Additionality is a key concept in carbon offsetting markets, which are designed to help reduce greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions or remove GHG from the atmosphere by allowing individuals, businesses, and organizations to invest in projects that result in the reduction, removal, or avoidance of GHG emissions. The idea behind additionality is that carbon offsets should represent real and additional reductions in GHG emissions that would not have occurred in the absence of the offset project. In other words, additionality is the degree to which the emissions reductions claimed by an offset project are above and beyond what would have happened anyway without the implementation of the GHG mitigation project. This is important because if an offset project is not additional, then purchasing its offsets will not result in any net reduction in GHG emissions. Additionality must be demonstrated prior to the implementation of the project or program during its validation. If it fails to demonstrate additionality, it cannot be registered for certification in Cercarbono. As part of the validation procedure, the VVB shall review the correct application of Cercarbono's tool to demonstrate additionality of climate change mitigation initiatives. The main elements of the additionality tool are legal framework analysis, special additionality cases, analysis of alternative scenarios, barrier analysis, financial or benchmark analysis. As a VVB staff, please bear in mind that the justification for the application of all these criteria should be demonstrated objectively and based on solid evidence, such as own, quantifiable and traceable or third-party, transparent and documented evidence, for example, national and international statistics, national, subnational and local policies and laws, studies and surveys from independent agencies. Let's analyze in detail important elements to be considered while evaluating the compliance of each of these criteria. In this first step, the VVB must review 2 elements: that the climate change mitigation initiative is consistent with existing laws or regulations, including those that have objectives other than generating GHG emissions mitigation, that the climate change mitigation initiative is not the result of compliance with a mandatory or legally mandated regulation or standard, nor is part of a mandatory environmental offset scheme. If any of the previous conditions is not met by the CCMP, the initiative must be rejected, and no further analysis is required. If the initiative has passed Step 1, the VVB must analyze if at least one of the following characteristics is met. It is the first of its kind. It implements exclusively restoration activities in the forest sector without commercial use. It derives its revenues exclusively from the carbon market. It is designed to neutralize the GHG emissions of a given company or institution, whose activities would correspond to sectoral areas other than those it normally undertakes. The activity to be implemented is included in the positive lists on the use of CDM technologies. If any of these conditions is met, then the initiative is considered additional, and no further analysis is required. If the initiative complies with Step 1 but is not one of the project types listed in Step 2, the validating VVB must review the analysis of alternative scenarios and determine whether the project has demonstrated that without carbon credits, the proposed initiative is not the most attractive scenario. If the proposed initiative is not the most financially attractive scenario, then the initiative is considered additional and no further analysis is required. If the initiative has not yet demonstrated its additionality in the previous steps, the VVB must assess the barrier analysis made by the project proponent and determine whether the project has demonstrated that there is a barrier preventing the implementation of the proposed alternative and that the carbon market would allow the initiative to overcome the barrier. If there is a barrier and the carbon market allow the initiative to overcome the barrier, then the initiative is considered additional and no further analysis is required. If the initiative has not yet demonstrated its additionality in the previous steps, the VVB must review if the project proponent has accomplished either a financial analysis or a benchmark analysis and demonstrate that the proposed initiative, without the revenues from the carbon market, is not the most attractive alternative. If the proposed initiative is not the most attractive alternative, then the initiative is considered additional. Otherwise, it is not deemed additional and it cannot pass the validation. As part of the procedures to ensure the permanence of credits issued from CCMPs in the land use sector, they shall include in their monitoring reports the tracking and management of the main risks identified in the application of the Cercarbono's buffer tool, including an analysis of their potential causes, their scale, and relative likelihood of future reversals. CCMPs are required to apply the most recent version of the buffer tool at validation and at each verification. For its part, the VVB must assess the application of the tool to the CCMP design as part of the validation, and subsequently assess the monitoring of identified risks and a further application of the tool during verifications. As part of the VVB procedures in the CCMP validations, the assessment of risks, uncertainties, and non-permanence of planned mitigation performed by the CCMPs as part of their project design should be reviewed through the application of the buffer tool. The VVB presents this assessment in the validation report for CCMPs in the land use sector. The VVB should primarily assess the implementation of the tool in relation to three main aspects. 1. That the basic information of the CCMP is correct, as stated in the PDD, which includes start date, lifespan, total area, whether it corresponds to a grouping or RED plus CCMP. If it is a grouped CCMP, that the areas and overall context of the instances correspond to those established in the PDD. 2. That the scores for each indicator assigned by the CCMP are consistent with what is established in the PDD. 3. That the evidence provided by the CCMP is sufficient to support the scores assigned to each risk indicator. The review of the scores assigned to the risk indicators and of the evidence presented by the CCMP should be carried out considering also what is reported in the monitoring sheet. For each indicator reported on the indicator sheet, the VVB must check that the evidence has been provided and approve or comment on it. Finally, the VVB officer in charge of the validation must fill in the final section of the monitoring sheet and the evaluation conclusions of the tool application in Section 7, risks, uncertainties, and non-permanence of the validation report for CCMP in the land use sector template, as shown at the beginning of this video. The VVB's review of the application of the tool in verifications is like that carried out in validations. At this stage, the changes achieved by the CCMP during the monitoring period should be reviewed, comparing that the report made for the validation is consistent with what is reported in the monitoring sheet and in the monitoring report. It is also necessary to check that the evidence is adequate and sufficient. Finally, check that the individual buffer release calculations, if the required conditions have been reached, are correct and consistent with what is reported in the monitoring report. Climate change mitigation initiatives carry a series of social, economic, and environmental co-benefits that go beyond the greenhouse gas removal and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Reporting the way in which the initiatives certified by Cercarbono contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals makes it possible to highlight their transversality, as well as highlight the added value and the differentiating factors thereof. Initiatives can report co-benefits generated by their program or project activity using the Cercarbono's tool to report contributions from climate change mitigation initiatives to the Sustainable Development Goals. In short, the SDGs tool. As part of the validation of the CCMPs, the VVB must assess their contribution to the proposed SDGs by verifying that they have completed the SDGs tool. 14 of the 17 SDGs have been considered to report the contributions by the CCMPs in the sectoral areas covered by Cercarbono's voluntary carbon certification program. Each sector has a certain number of SDGs pre-selected and identified as material, that is relevant, in the SDG materiality matrix by sector. The first step in the review of the CCMP's application of the tool is to verify that the materiality of the indicators has been correctly identified and that they are relevant to the specific situation of the CCMP. The VVB should then check that the tool has been filled in correctly, both in the general information and summary of the CCMP contributions in the context of the SDGs, and in the description of the different contributions, together with their causal relationship and the provision of evidence. For each indicator reported, the VVB must review the evidence provided and decide whether it is sufficient to support the indicator. If necessary, the VVB may comment on each of the indicators and request, if appropriate, additional information or any other relevant modifications. Consistency in the timing of the contributions and evidence is required. That is, if the tool for a certain period is completed, for example, during 2023, the attached evidence must be framed within such period, as well as all the additional information that allows supporting the contribution. Once the correctly completed tool and supporting evidence are submitted, the VVB will approve the contributions or make comments to the CCMP holder or developer so that they can make the corresponding adjustments. The approval is accomplished in the Cercarbono's SDG Tool Review rubric. The review of the information provided by the holder or developer of the CCMP will be evaluated under the following rubric, considering three components: A. Causal relationship; B. Indicators and contributions to the SDGs; C. Evidence. In the case of RED plus programs or projects, the conceptual difference between safeguards and co-benefits or non-carbon benefits should be emphasized. Environmental and social safeguards are minimum requirements of mandatory compliance. However, there is a partial overlap, since some Cancun safeguards can be considered as co-benefits. UNFCCC 2014. Cercarbono Certified Carbon Standard.